No one questioned it at first. Everything about the moment felt too perfect to doubt. The lighting was soft, almost cinematic. The setting looked carefully chosen, like something out of a movie scene designed to trigger emotion. And right at the center of it all, a man dropped to one knee, holding a ring that caught just enough light to make it sparkle on camera. It was the kind of proposal people dream about, the kind people save, the kind people compare their own lives to. Within hours, the video began spreading. Comments flooded in from strangers who had never met her but felt deeply connected to the moment. People were congratulating her, calling it beautiful, calling it rare, calling it proof that real love still exists in a world that often feels empty of it. Some even admitted it made them emotional. Others said it gave them hope. Because moments like that don't just entertain people. They mean something. They remind people of what they believe love should be. But what if that belief was built on something that wasn't real? What if that entire moment wasn't spontaneous? What if it wasn't driven by love at all? The story took a sharp turn when Candace Owens entered the conversation. Known for her unapologetic opinions and willingness to say what others won't, she didn't approach this like a rumor. She treated it like a problem, a symptom of something bigger. And when she spoke, people listened, because what she said wasn't just controversial. It was unsettling. She claimed that the proposal people had been celebrating may not have been real, that it may have been arranged, planned, controlled. And even more shocking than that Erica Kirk may have paid her own ex to carry it out. At first, it sounded unbelievable, almost ridiculous, because a proposal isn't just another moment. It's supposed to be one of the most meaningful, emotional turning points in a relationship. It represents commitment, vulnerability, a decision to move forward together. You don't expect something like that to be staged. You don't expect it to be bought. But that's exactly why the accusation hit so hard. Because if it's true, it doesn't just change how you see that one video. It changes how you see everything behind it. It forces you to question the authenticity of the smiles, the reactions, the emotions that seemed so genuine at first glance. Were they real? Or were they part of a performance designed to look real? And once that question enters your mind, it's hard to ignore, because suddenly, you're not just watching a proposal anymore. You're analyzing it, looking for signs, replaying moments, trying to figure out what felt off and why. And that's when the shift begins. The same video that once felt heartwarming starts to feel calculated. The same moment that once inspired people begins to raise suspicion. Because perfection, when examined closely, often reveals something unexpected. Control. Every detail in that proposal now seemed too intentional, too precise, too polished, as if nothing was left to chance. And that's when a deeper, more uncomfortable question starts to surface. Why would someone go that far? Why would someone create a moment like that if it wasn't real? Was it about attention, validation, the need to be seen, admired, envied? Or was it something deeper? Something harder to admit? Because in a world where social media rewards perfection, being loved isn't always enough. Being seen as loved becomes everything. And that's what makes this story so powerful. Because it's not just about one woman. It's not just about one proposal. It's about the possibility that some of the most meaningful moments we see online might not be real at all. And if that's the case, then what else are we believing that isn't true? At first, people resisted the idea, not because the accusation didn't sound serious, but because it sounded too extreme to accept. The mind naturally looks for simpler explanations, miscommunication, misinterpretation, maybe a joke taken too far, anything that would allow the moment to remain real. Because once you accept that something like this could be staged, it forces you to question far more than just one video. And that's uncomfortable. But Candace Owens didn't present it as a misunderstanding. She spoke with certainty, with intention, as if she wasn't just reacting, but exposing. And that tone changed everything. Because when someone speaks with that level of conviction, people don't just hear it. They start to investigate it. Slowly, the conversation shifted from disbelief to curiosity. People began revisiting the proposal, watching it again, but this time, not with emotion, with suspicion. Details that once felt romantic started to feel unusual. The timing of the camera angles, the positioning, the reactions, even the pacing of the moment itself. It all felt too clean, too structured, too intentional. And when something feels that controlled, people start asking a dangerous question. Was this ever meant to be real? Or was it designed to look real? As attention grew, so did the pressure on Erica Kirk. Because in the world of the internet, silence doesn't protect you. It magnifies everything. Every hour without a response becomes part of the narrative. Every unanswered question becomes its own answer. And the longer things remained unclear, the more people filled in the gaps themselves. Some defended her. They argued that even if it were true, it shouldn't matter. That people have the right to create their own happiness. That not every relationship needs to follow traditional rules. But others saw it very differently. They saw deception, not just a private decision, but a public illusion. Because the moment wasn't kept between two people. It was shared, broadcast, consumed by thousands of people who believed they were witnessing something genuine. And that's where the line was crossed. Because once something is presented as real, it carries responsibility. It shapes perception. It influences belief. And if that belief is based on something artificial, then the impact becomes real, even if the moment itself wasn't. That's what made this situation so much bigger than just one person. It tapped into a growing tension that already existed. The tension between real life and curated life. Because social media doesn't reward honesty. It rewards attention. It rewards emotion. It rewards moments that look extraordinary, even if they aren't. And over time, that reward system begins to change behavior. People don't just share their lives anymore. They shape them, edit them, refine them, until what's left is no longer a reflection of reality, but a version of reality designed to perform. And if staging a proposal brings attention, then suddenly, staging doesn't feel wrong. It feels strategic. That's the shift that Candace Owens was pointing at. Because in her view, this wasn't just about one decision. It was about a mindset. A mindset where authenticity becomes optional, as long as the result is impressive enough. And that idea struck a nerve. Because deep down, people recognize it. Even if they don't want to admit it, they've seen it before. Perfect relationships that fall apart overnight. Influencers who appear happy until something exposes the truth. Moments that feel powerful until they're revealed to be staged. This wasn't new, but this time it felt more direct, more obvious, more difficult to ignore. Because a proposal isn't just another piece of content. It's supposed to mean something. It's supposed to represent a real connection, a real decision, a real future. So when something like that is questioned, it hits differently. It feels like something important is being taken away. And that's why people reacted so strongly. Not just because of what may have happened, but because of what it represents. A world where even the most meaningful moments can be constructed, controlled, and possibly purchased. And once that idea takes hold, it doesn't stay contained to one story. It spreads, because now every perfect moment starts to feel uncertain. Every emotional video becomes questionable. Every real story comes with doubt. And that doubt changes the way people see everything. Because once you start questioning what's real, you don't stop at one example. You start looking at all of it. And that's when the story stops being about Erica and starts becoming about something much bigger. A system where perception is everything and reality becomes secondary. The deeper people looked, the less it felt like a coincidence. Because when something is real, it usually carries imperfections, small pauses, unexpected reactions, moments that don't quite go as planned. That's what makes something human. But this felt different. too smooth, too aligned, too perfectly timed to capture attention at exactly the right moment. And that's when people started asking a more uncomfortable question. Not just, was this staged, but was it designed to go viral? Because there's a difference. Staging something is one thing. Designing it for attention is another. And once that idea entered the conversation, everything changed. Because now, the proposal wasn't just being questioned as a personal moment. It was being analyzed as a piece of content, a product, something created with an outcome in mind. Views, engagement, reactions. And suddenly, every detail started to feel intentional in a different way. The lighting wasn't just romantic. It was optimized. The angle wasn't just natural. It was strategic. The emotion wasn't just felt. It was delivered. And that's where the story becomes more than just a rumor. Because if something like this was created for attention, then it reveals something about the environment that rewards it. An environment where real moments don't always perform well enough, where authenticity can be overlooked, and where the most powerful currency is not truth, but impact. That's the system Candace Owens was challenging. Because from her perspective, this wasn't just about exposing one situation. It was about exposing a pattern where people feel pressured to elevate their lives into something more dramatic than they actually are. Not because they want to lie, but because they feel like reality isn't enough. And that pressure is subtle. It doesn't announce itself. It builds slowly, through comparison, through scrolling, through seeing other people's perfect moments over and over again, until eventually, normal life starts to feel invisible. And when something feels invisible, people start looking for ways to be seen. That's where things begin to shift, because the goal is no longer to experience a moment. It becomes to present it, to package it, to make sure it lands the way it's supposed to. And once that mindset takes over, the line between living and performing becomes almost impossible to see. That's what made the accusation against Erica Kirk so powerful, because it wasn't just shocking. It felt believable. Not because people knew it was true, but because it fit into something they had already sensed. That not everything online is what it seems. That some of the most emotional moments might also be the most constructed. And when people start to believe that, trust begins to erode. Not just toward one person, but toward everything. Because if one proposal can be staged, then any proposal can be staged. If one relationship can be presented in a certain way, then any relationship can be. And once that door opens, it doesn't close. Because now every emotional moment carries a layer of doubt. Every perfect story feels slightly less certain. And every viral video becomes something to question, instead of simply experience. That's the real impact of a story like this. It doesn't just create drama. It creates distance. Distance between what people see and what they believe. And that distance changes behavior. People become more skeptical, more analytical, less willing to trust what they're shown. But at the same time, they continue to watch. Because even if something feels staged, it can still be compelling. And that's the paradox. People don't just want reality. They want something that feels bigger than reality. Something that captures attention. Something that makes them feel something instantly. And that demand shapes what gets created. So if the audience rewards perfection, creators will produce perfection, even if that perfection has to be constructed, even if it has to be controlled, even if it isn't entirely real. And that brings the story to a deeper, more unsettling realization. Maybe this wasn't just about one person making a questionable decision. Maybe it was about a system that quietly encourages those decisions. A system where attention determines value, where perception outweighs truth, and where the difference between reality and performance is becoming harder to define. Because, in the end, if something looks real, feels real, and goes viral, does it even matter if it wasn't real at all? And that's when the conversation shifted, from curiosity to discomfort. Because once people started to accept that the proposal might have been staged, a new question emerged. Not, is this true? But why would someone do this? That question is far more dangerous because it doesn't just examine the action. It examines the motive, and motives reveal things people don't always want to face. At first, the simplest explanation seemed obvious. Attention. In a world where attention can be turned into influence, and influence can be turned into money, creating a viral moment isn't just appealing. It's valuable. But the more people thought about it, the less that explanation felt complete. Because attention alone doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain the emotional risk. It doesn't explain the potential backlash. It doesn't explain why someone would take something as deeply personal as a proposal and turn it into something transactional. So the conversation went deeper. And what people found there was far more uncomfortable. Because beneath the idea of attention lies something else. Validation. The need to feel chosen. The need to feel wanted. The need to be seen by others as someone who is loved. And in many ways, that need is universal. Everyone wants to feel it, but not everyone is willing to construct it. That's where the line is drawn. And that's the line this story appears to cross. Because if the accusation is true, then the proposal wasn't just staged. It was engineered to send a message. A message that says, I am desired, I am valued, I am chosen. Even if that message had to be created artificially, that's the deeper layer that Candace Owens was pointing toward. Because from her perspective, this wasn't empowerment. It wasn't independence. It wasn't someone taking control of their life. It was something else entirely. A reflection of how far people are willing to go, to feel validated. And that reflection made people uncomfortable, because it hit close to home. Not everyone would stage a proposal, but many people understand the pressure to appear successful, to appear happy, to appear like they have something others want. And that pressure doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from comparison. Scrolling through endless images of people who seem to have it all. Perfect relationships, perfect moments, perfect lives. Until eventually reality starts to feel like it's not enough. Not exciting enough. Not impressive enough. Not worthy of attention. And when reality feels insufficient, people start to adjust it. At first in small ways. Better angles. Better lighting. Carefully chosen moments. But over time, those adjustments can grow. Until eventually, the moment itself becomes something that is created, not experienced. And that's the tipping point. Because once a moment is created for perception, it stops being about what it means and starts being about how it looks. That's what makes this situation so powerful. Because it forces people to confront a difficult truth that the line between authenticity and performance is not as clear as they thought. And in some cases, it may not exist at all. Meanwhile, the silence surrounding Erica Kirk continued to fuel speculation. Because people expect responses. They expect explanations. They expect clarity. And when those expectations aren't met, they create their own narratives. Some believed she was being unfairly targeted, that the situation was exaggerated, that people were jumping to conclusions without full context. But others saw the silence differently, not as protection, but as avoidance. And in the court of public opinion, perception often matters more than truth, because people don't just respond to facts. They respond to what feels convincing. And right now, what felt convincing was doubt. Doubt about the proposal, doubt about the relationship, doubt about the authenticity of the entire situation. And once doubt takes hold, it spreads. Because doubt is contagious. It doesn't stay focused on one moment. It expands into other moments, other stories, other people, until eventually it reshapes how everything is viewed. That's the ripple effect of a story like this. It doesn't just question one person, it questions an entire culture. A culture where perception is curated, where moments are optimized, where emotions can be shaped to fit a narrative. And once that culture is exposed, even slightly, it becomes impossible to see it the same way again. Because now, every perfect moment carries a question. Is this real? Or is this designed? And that question changes everything. And once that question takes hold, it starts to change the way people see not just the story, but the person at the center of it. Because if a proposal can be designed, then love itself begins to look less like an emotion and more like a strategy. Less like something shared between two people and more like something arranged to create a reaction. That is where the story becomes even more unsettling. It is no longer just about whether a moment was fake. It becomes about what kind of mindset can turn something sacred into something managed. That is when another word started to appear more often in the conversation. Control. Not romance. Not spontaneity. Control. Because when people looked at the situation through that lens, everything started to feel different. A staged proposal is not simply a lie. It is a controlled outcome. It is a moment where uncertainty has been removed, emotion has been shaped, and the result has been decided in advance. Nothing is left to chance. Nothing is left to genuine vulnerability. The risk of rejection is gone. The unpredictability that makes love feel alive is gone. What remains is a scene that looks emotional on the outside, but may be empty at its core. That is why this story disturbed so many people. Real love is messy. It comes with fear. It comes with not knowing exactly how the other person will respond. It comes with the possibility of embarrassment, disappointment, and heartbreak. That is part of what gives it meaning. The risk is what makes the moment matter. The uncertainty is what makes the commitment feel real. But if that uncertainty is removed and replaced by a payment, an agreement, or a planned script, then what exactly is left? A visual, a performance, a product. And that is what made the criticism from Candace Owens feel bigger than a personal attack. In her framing, this was not simply a story about one woman making a questionable choice. It was a warning about a culture that has become obsessed with controlling how life appears rather than living it honestly. In that kind of culture, authenticity becomes dangerous because it cannot be fully managed. It can fail, it can disappoint, it can look awkward, but a performance can be polished, a performance can be edited, a performance can be designed to win. And that is the temptation. Because when people live in front of an audience, control becomes addictive. It starts small, choosing what to post, choosing the best angle, choosing the best caption. Then it becomes choosing which parts of life are shown and which parts are hidden. Then, for some people, it becomes something even more serious. Instead of capturing a real moment, they begin creating moments specifically to be captured. They no longer ask, "What am I experiencing?" They ask, "How will this look?" That shift changes everything. It changes relationships because they are no longer judged only by what they feel like from the inside. They are judged by how convincing they appear from the outside. It changes self-worth because value becomes tied to reaction. Did people respond? Did they believe it? Did they admire it? Did they envy it? If the answer is yes, then the performance succeeded, even if the reality behind it was hollow. And that is what makes the idea of paying for a proposal feel so dark, because it suggests a person may not simply want love, they may want the image of love, they may want the social proof of being chosen, they may want the emotional authority that comes from being seen as desired. In a world driven by visibility, that image can become more powerful than the truth itself. And the truth is often much harder to face. The truth may be loneliness. The truth may be insecurity. The truth may be the fear that being loved naturally is not going to happen, at least not in the way one hopes. And for some people, that fear is unbearable, so they do not wait for the moment. They construct it. They do not trust love to arrive on its own terms. They force it into a form that can be seen, shared, and believed. That is not just deception. It is desperation shaped into spectacle. And once people started to interpret the story that way, the tone of the conversation changed again. This was no longer just internet gossip. It became psychological. People were no longer only asking if the proposal happened the way it appeared. They were asking what kind of emptiness might exist behind the need to make it appear that way at all. At the same time, there was another uncomfortable layer to all of this. Because control is never only about the person creating the image. It is also about the audience receiving it. Controlled moments work because people want to believe them. People are drawn to emotional certainty. They want stories with clean endings, symbolic gestures, and beautiful visuals. They want reassurance that love still looks magical, that life can still unfold in ways that feel cinematic. So when someone gives them that image, they reward it. That reward is powerful. It tells creators exactly what works. It tells them that polished emotion is more valuable than messy truth. It tells them that if they can make people feel something quickly enough, the deeper reality may never matter. And that is where the system begins to feed itself. The audience craves perfection. The creator supplies it. The platform amplifies it. And slowly reality starts losing the competition. Because reality is uneven. Reality is slow. Reality does not always go viral. Performance does. Which leads to a deeper and more troubling question. If this proposal was not just staged but controlled from beginning to end, then was the goal ever love in the first place? Or was the real goal to eliminate uncertainty, manufacture validation, and take ownership of the story before reality had a chance to say something different? That question sits at the center of everything. Because once love becomes something to control, it stops being an experience and starts becoming an image. And once a person begins living for the image, they may eventually lose track of the thing the image was supposed to represent. That is the tragedy hiding beneath the drama. Not just that people may be faking love, but that they may no longer remember what real love looks like when no one is watching, and that is where the backlash truly reached its peak. Because once people began to see the possibility of control behind the moment, the emotional response changed completely. It was no longer just shock, it was disappointment. A sense that something meaningful had been taken and turned into something artificial. People weren't just reacting to Erica Kirk anymore. They were reacting to what they had felt. Because many of them had believed in that moment. They had watched it and felt something real inside themselves. Hope, warmth, maybe even a quiet comparison to their own lives. That is the power of a well-presented emotional story. It doesn't stay on the screen. It transfers into the viewer. And that is why the reaction was so strong. Because when that kind of moment is questioned, it doesn't just expose the person who created it. It exposes the people who believed it. And that creates a different kind of discomfort. No one likes to feel like they were misled. No one likes to realize that something they trusted may not have been true. So instead of simply moving on, people pushed harder. They analyzed more. They debated more. They split into sides. Some continued to defend the idea that even if the moment was staged, it did not necessarily invalidate the feelings behind it. They argued that relationships are complex, that people express love in different ways, and that not everything has to fit a traditional definition to be meaningful. But others rejected that completely, because to them, intention matters. And if the intention behind the proposal was not genuine, then the entire moment loses its meaning. That is the core of the conflict. Not just what happened, but what it represents. Because if a proposal can be manufactured, then it challenges one of the most deeply held beliefs about relationships, that certain moments are sacred, that they cannot be replaced, that they cannot be replicated on demand. And once that belief is shaken, it does not easily return. That is why voices like Candace Owens gained so much attention during this situation. Because she was not just reacting emotionally, she was framing the issue in a way that connected to something larger. A cultural shift. A shift where authenticity is no longer the standard. Where appearance becomes the priority. Where people begin to curate not just what they share, but what they experience. And that shift is subtle. It does not happen all at once. It builds over time, through small decisions, small edits, small adjustments, until eventually the difference between living a moment and creating a moment becomes almost impossible to distinguish. And when that happens, something important gets lost. Because real moments are not always perfect. They are unpredictable. They are flawed. They carry imperfections that cannot be edited out. That is what gives them depth. That is what makes them meaningful. But in a system that rewards perfection, those imperfections become liabilities, and so people remove them. They refine the moment until it looks exactly the way it is supposed to. And when enough people do that, a new standard is created. A standard that is not based on reality, but on presentation. And that is where the real danger lies. Because once people begin comparing their real lives to curated moments, the comparison is never fair. Reality cannot compete with something that has been designed to look perfect. And over time, that creates pressure. Pressure to match. Pressure to perform. Pressure to present a version of life that feels worthy of attention. That is the environment this story exists within. It is not isolated. It is part of a larger pattern, and that is why it resonated so widely. Because even if people are not directly involved, they recognize the dynamic. They have felt it. They have seen it. They have participated in it, even in small ways. And that recognition makes the story more than just drama. It makes it reflective. Because now, the focus is no longer only on what happened. It is on why it feels so familiar, why it feels possible, why it feels like something that could happen again. And that leads to a deeper realization. Maybe this is not about one person making an extreme choice. Maybe it is about a system that slowly pushes people toward those choices. A system where attention is rewarded, where visibility defines value, where perception can shape reality. And once that system is understood, a new question begins to emerge. Not about Erica, not about Candace, but about everyone watching. If the system rewards what looks perfect, then who is responsible for changing it? Because as long as perfection is what gets attention, perfection, real or not, is what people will continue to create. That question is where everything begins to turn inward. Because for most of the story, the focus has been external. What did Erica Kirk do? What did Candace Owens say? Who is right? Who is wrong? But now, the focus shifts, and it becomes much harder to avoid. Because once you start asking who is responsible for the system, you cannot ignore the role of the audience. It is easy to criticize the person who creates the illusion. It is much harder to examine the people who reward it. Because moments like that proposal do not become viral by accident. They become viral because people choose to engage with them. They choose to watch. They choose to share. They choose to believe. And most importantly, they choose to amplify. That amplification is not passive. It is active. Every like, every comment, every share. It signals to the system what matters, what deserves attention, what should be pushed further. And over time, that signal becomes a pattern that shapes what gets created next. So if the audience consistently rewards perfection, then perfection, real or not, becomes the goal. If the audience reacts more strongly to dramatic, emotional, highly polished moments, then those are the moments that will be produced. Even if they have to be constructed, even if they have to be controlled. And that is the uncomfortable truth, because it means the system is not imposed from above. It is built from within. It is built by millions of small decisions made every single day. Decisions about what to watch, what to engage with, what to believe, and what to ignore. That is why this story feels so different, because it does not allow people to remain neutral. It forces a level of awareness. It forces people to question their own behavior. How often have we chosen the most perfect-looking story over the most honest one? How often have we ignored something real because it was not exciting enough? How often have we contributed, even unknowingly, to the very system we criticize? These are not easy questions, because they do not have simple answers. But they reveal something important, that the demand for perfection does not come from nowhere. It comes from us. And once that realization settles in, the entire narrative changes. Because now, The story is no longer just about deception. It is about participation. Participation in a culture where perception is often more valuable than truth, where emotional impact is prioritized over authenticity, where the most compelling version of reality wins, regardless of whether it is real. And that is where the tension becomes impossible to ignore, because people want authenticity. They say they value it. They claim they prefer it. But their behavior does not always reflect that, because authenticity is unpredictable. It is not always entertaining. It does not always deliver immediate emotional payoff. And in a fast-moving digital environment, that can be a disadvantage. So even when people recognize something feels staged, they may still engage with it because it is compelling, because it is polished, because it creates a strong reaction. And that reaction is what drives everything. That is the paradox at the center of this story. People are drawn to what feels real, but they are also drawn to what feels intense. And sometimes, the most intense moments are the most constructed. So the system continues, not because people are unaware, but because the incentives remain the same. And as long as those incentives do not change, the behavior will not change either. That is the deeper layer of what Candace Owens was pointing toward. Because calling out one situation does not fix the pattern. It only reveals it. The real change would require something else entirely. A shift in what people choose to value. A shift in what they choose to engage with. A shift in what they decide deserves attention. But that kind of shift is difficult. Because it requires people to act against their own impulses. To choose something quieter over something dramatic. To choose something real over something perfect. And that is not easy in a system designed to reward the opposite. So the question remains, not just for creators, but for everyone. If the audience continues to reward what looks perfect, even when it is not real, then can anything truly authentic survive in that environment? Or will authenticity slowly disappear? Not because it does not exist, but because it no longer gets seen. By now, the story has moved far beyond a single proposal. It has become something much deeper, something more uncomfortable. Because what started as a shocking accusation has turned into a reflection of how people live, how they present themselves, and how they define value in a world that is constantly watching. At this stage, it is no longer just about whether Erica Kirk paid for a proposal. It is about why that idea feels possible in the first place. Because if this story had surfaced 10 or 20 years ago, it might have sounded absurd, unbelievable, almost impossible to imagine. But today, it feels plausible, and that says something. It says that the environment has changed. It says that the boundaries between real and constructed experiences have shifted. And most importantly, it says that people are becoming more comfortable with the idea of shaping reality instead of simply living it. That is the deeper transformation happening beneath the surface. Because in a world where everything is visible, everything becomes performative. Not just the big moments, but the small ones too. People do not just go out anymore. They document it. They do not just celebrate. They present it. They do not just experience. They capture. And over time, that constant awareness of being seen begins to change behavior. Moments are no longer just lived. They are evaluated in real time. How does this look? Is this worth sharing? Will this get attention? And when those questions become automatic, something subtle begins to shift. The purpose of the moment changes. It is no longer only about the experience itself. It becomes about the reaction it will generate. That is the environment this story exists within. And that is why it resonates so strongly. Because even if people have never staged something as extreme as a proposal, many have adjusted their reality in smaller ways, filtered it, framed it, edited it, until what remains is a version that feels slightly better than the truth. And that behavior, repeated millions of times, creates a new standard. A standard where authenticity is no longer raw. It is refined, polished, presented. That is the tension at the center of everything. because people still say they value what is real, but what they engage with often tells a different story. They are drawn to intensity, to perfection, to moments that feel larger than life. And those moments are rarely accidental. They are created. That is what Candace Owens was pointing toward from the very beginning. Not just a single act, but a cultural direction. A direction where people are no longer satisfied with experiencing life. They feel the need to elevate it, to amplify it, to make it worthy of attention, and in some cases, to manufacture it entirely. That is where things become dangerous. Because once reality is no longer enough, the pressure to enhance it does not stop. It grows, it expands, and it begins to affect how people see themselves. Because if the version of life that gets attention is always better, more exciting, more perfect, then normal life starts to feel inadequate. Even when it is real, even when it is meaningful. And that feeling creates a quiet kind of dissatisfaction, a sense that something is missing. Not because it actually is, but because it does not look the way it is supposed to. That is the psychological impact of a system built on perception. And that is why stories like this matter. Not because they are rare, but because they reveal something that is happening everywhere. On a smaller scale, in quieter ways, in moments that do not go viral, but still follow the same pattern. The pattern of shaping reality to meet expectation, instead of allowing reality to exist on its own terms. And that leads to the most important realization of all. This is not just about one person. It is not just about one decision. It is about a direction that raises a final, unavoidable question. If people continue to prioritize how life looks over how it feels, then what happens when the performance becomes more important than the experience? What happens when being seen replaces being present? What happens when validation from others becomes more meaningful than truth within yourself? Because once that shift happens, it does not just change behavior, it changes identity. And when identity becomes tied to perception, it becomes fragile, dependent, always needing to be maintained, always needing to be reinforced. And that is a difficult place to live, because it is never stable. It is always at risk, always dependent on the next moment, the next reaction, the next piece of validation. And that is why this story feels so heavy, because beneath the drama, there is something real. Not the proposal, not the performance, but the pattern. A pattern that raises one final question. If a life can be built around how it appears, then what happens when no one is watching anymore?